Now, for lesson 2, I want to talk about different definitions of abundance. In other words, if you're going to create an abundant life, a personal reality of abundance, you're going to have to get very clear with intention on what that abundant life looks like for you. So I'm going to give you different definitions and then ask you to come up with your own definition of your personal reality of abundance. So let's start. Here's the first definition. Abundance as fulfillment of purpose, a deep sense of peace, contentment, and alignment with one's higher purpose. Someone who's on purpose in their life, you'll learn a lot about this in this course, who's fulfilling that purpose, who's making a difference in the world, is certainly an abundant person. Abundance as holistic richness, a life overflowing with richness in relationships, health, joy, love, and personal fulfillment, touching every facet of existence. Have an abundance of joy, love, and personal fulfillment along with health and healthy relationships is a rich person. The next one, abundance as simple excess, the state of possessing more than what is necessary to meet one's needs, to have more than you need. That's abundance. Abundance as surplus and freedom, once again, a state of having more than enough, whether it's tangible, like wealth or time or resources, or intangible, like happiness and love, characterized by generosity, the freedom from lack, and the capacity to share without depletion. That would be abundance as surplus and freedom. The freedom to do whatever you want, whenever you want. The next one, abundance as financial flow. This is how most people relate to abundance, a steady stream of money and resources, granting freedom to live with fulfillment and ease. The ease of living because you're financially stable. Abundance as sustaining joy, a life brimming with everything required to sustain oneself and others in joy, purpose, and mutual support. That is a joyful, abundant life. Abundance as endless creation, a state of constant growth and expansion where new possibilities emerge endlessly, ensuring that even if one were to give everything away, more would follow. I like this definition a lot because it talks about opportunities, continuously creating new possibilities and new opportunities, and it frames abundance bigger than just finances and wealth. Abundance as an optimistic mindset, a way of being that embraces positivity, gratitude, generosity, and faith in limitless growth and prosperity across all areas of life. Optimistic mindset. Last one, abundance as empowered sharing, the act of creating more than enough to share with others, fostering mastery over life, gratitude, and presence. To have so much that you're empowered to share. Now, the personality of abundance creates the personal reality of abundance. So in order for us to create the personal reality of abundance, that means we have to change our personality. It would be prudent then to study the qualities and characteristics of an abundant person. So I'm going to take the time now to go over some of those qualities and characteristics because you're going to use those qualities and characteristics as raw materials in your meditation to change. So let's start with the qualities of an abundant person. An abundant person tends to be a visionary. Not only are they a visionary, but they're able to see that vision through until it's realized. That means they're very purpose-driven. They're driven by a mission or a purpose that's typically bigger than them. They're independent thinkers. They don't fall into the way everybody thinks. They tend to think outside the box or think in different ways. They constantly stay inspired, independent of the conditions in their life. They tend to be very self-aware, very self-conscious. They're emotionally intelligent. That means that they know how to shorten their emotional responses to the circumstances and conditions in their life. They tend to be very focused on a goal or an outcome. They tend to be adaptable. They're able to flow and change. They're very resilient. They're very grateful for life and where they are in their life. They tend to be very humble. They're very optimistic in spite of what's going on in their world. They tend to see the purposeful good in everything. They tend to be ambitious. They set realistic goals and they accomplish those goals. They take risks and they master risk-taking. They constantly believe in possibilities, or at least think that there's another way to do something, and that causes them to come up with new ideas. They embrace change all the time and they see change as an opportunity to grow. They sustain abundance mindset. Even if they lose everything, they still have that abundance mindset and they're uncompromising to that mindset. They have a very healthy relationship with money. They're not needy. They're not in lack. They have a good, solid relationship with their understanding of money. They create opportunity from the challenges that they have in their life. They like to challenge themselves. They're super creative. They learn information and they immediately apply it. They tend to lead by example. They're very practical. They're pragmatists. They learn information. It makes sense to them. They're going to use it in some way. They learn from their mistakes. In other words, when they do something and they don't get the outcome they want, they learn that it wouldn't be a good idea to do it again. They have excellent work ethics. They forge their own path. They're disciplined and they're consistent. They stay with things until the end. They tend to be persistent and very determined. Abundant people are very generous. They celebrate their victories by themselves or with others. They thrive in the discomfort that causes them to overcome. They can maintain order in the midst of chaos. They're very effective in their communication. They're self-confident. They overcome loss very easily. They have the energy and the passion to arrive at their means. They take time to be by themselves or take time for themselves. And they tend to manage their attention and their time very well. Now, let's get into the personality traits of a person who lives in scarcity or lack. And this is important because in order for you to become the personality of abundance, you have to overcome the personality of lack. So let's go through some of these because you may recognize some of those that you may want to change for yourself. A person who lives in lack, that personality tends to have a lack mindset. They see everything as if they don't have it. They're waiting for some situation or circumstance in their life to change that allows them to believe that they can change. They tend to have a victim mentality. They believe that someone or something is causing them to think and feel and act in certain ways. They constantly make excuses. They blame others for their life, and they complain often. They're procrastinators. They constantly have no energy to do anything. They never have enough time. This is all lack, by the way. They never have enough money. They're chronically disbelieving in possibility. They argue against those possibilities and for their limitations. They have no confidence. They fear taking risks. They miss opportunities even when they're presented to them. They won't take the risk and step into the unknown. They constantly make the same mistakes because they constantly do the same things and make the same choices. They're constantly or consistently uninspired. They're not an independent thinker. They're constantly doubting themselves. They overanalyze and overthink. They're addicted to the hormones of stress, and they use the problems and conditions in their life to reaffirm their addiction to that stress. They constantly live in survival. They obsess about the problems and their pain. They are always headed in the same direction. They exhibit incoherent thinking, and they keep telling the same story from their past. And if you understand anything about neuroscience, if you keep reaffirming the same story of your past, that becomes your identity. They tend to have bad habits. They tend to sabotage their goals. They can't manage their time. They're easily overwhelmed by the circumstances in their life. They tend to be very self-involved, self-centered, self-aggrandizing, full of self-pity. It's all about the self. They lack emotional intelligence. Their emotions tend to drive their behaviors and their choices. They look outside of themselves for some type of inspiration. They're easily discouraged. They're easily distracted from their vision or their goal. They have difficulty focusing. They have no vision. They are unaware of any other possibilities because they're rigid in the way they process thought. They see the self and the world as unchangeable. They don't think it's possible to change their life or to change themselves. They rarely take action steps. They're very philosophical, very theoretical, but they never do anything. They tend to be very lazy. They crave the same experiences in their life. They fear making mistakes, so they don't act. They're easily influenced by other people's beliefs. Other people's beliefs talk them out of their vision. They're very predictable in their life. That means they live in the familiar and the known. They constantly regret every single day. They tend to be entitled. They compare themselves to others. They're envious and jealous. They spend more than they earn. They've stopped learning anything new. They focus on worst case scenarios. And some of the latest research says that 85% of the time when we focus on the worst case scenario, it doesn't happen. Now, I want to expand your personal definition of abundance because most people think that abundance just has to do with finances and wealth and money. But you can have an abundance of energy, an abundance of vitality. In other words, you could have all the wealth and the money in the world, but if you don't have any energy and vitality to enjoy it, it doesn't mean anything. You can have an abundance of love in intimate relationships. You can have an abundance of friends and family that's meaningful. You can have an abundance of homes or an abundance of beautiful things in your home or in your living situation. You can have an abundance of time, an abundance of freedom to do whatever you want, whenever you want. You can have an abundance of new and mystical experiences, of synchronicities. This is my favorite, an abundance of opportunities. People think they need money to create the life that they want, but really we've been programmed into believing that we can create as many opportunities as we want. We can have an abundance of opportunities. And of course, then you can have an abundance of material things like art or shoes or clothes or cars or tools or books or wine or boats, rare collectibles, things and objects. You can have an abundance of them. And finally, an abundance of virtue: gratitude, patience, humility, compassion, love, joy, confidence. I'd like for you to expand your understanding of your personal definition of abundance. Now, here's your homework for this particular session. I want you to get very clear on your personal vision of abundance. What does that mean? Given everything you've learned, I want you to take a few moments to create your own personal definition of abundance. Now, it's really important for you to write it down. I know that sounds old school, but there's a process that takes place in the brain. It's called the ideomotor response. When you tend to write things down, you tend to remember them better and you tend to access your subconscious mind. I want you to write a complete sentence of your personal definition of abundance. Once you've written it down and you've gotten it all worked out, I want you to, without looking at that definition, see if you can write it based on memory. If you can't write it based on memory, turn and look at it and fill in the blanks. The brain learns by mistakes. And by the third time, see if you can write it down in its completion without looking at it. You have to commit it to memory. In other words, it's got to be wired in your brain. You got to know exactly what you want, and you have to know your own personal understanding or definition of abundance. Now, once you have that definition wired in your brain, the next thing I want you to do is I want you to draw a symbol which will inspire you when you think of your personal reality of abundance. Now, this symbol represents your vision of your abundant life. The vision of your personal reality of abundance, based on what you wrote down, is you creating some type of symbol. A for abundance, a fleur-de-lis, the sun in your life, the sun rising in your life, you're in love with your life, you're on top of the world, a dollar sign. It doesn't matter what it is. It could be simple or it could be elaborate. But this symbol, when you look at the symbol, it will remind you of your definition of an abundant life. We are going to be using this symbol through the entire course as your North Star for you to have a very clear intention of what that abundant life is. So take a moment and make sure you have your symbol. And once you have your symbol, if you want to put your symbol on your cell phone, on your desktop, if you want to put it on a sticky or a piece of paper and put it in a mirror next to your bathroom, put it next to your nightstand or on your nightstand in some way, it's to cue you, to remind you of what you're creating. So we'll be using this throughout the entire course. Make sure that you love the symbol that you create. We're about ready to start the next lesson, but please make sure you have this done before we move on.